Before I get into this, I want to ask you something. Do you think you're a good person? Most people do. Most people have this line in their head, something they'd never do, some version of themselves they'd protect. But hold on to that, because we're coming back to it. So it's 1961. There's a philosopher named Hannah Arendt, and she's sitting in a courtroom in Jerusalem watching the trial of one of the men responsible for the Holocaust. His name was Adolf Eichmann, and she went there expecting to see a monster. What she actually found was this small, boring, ordinary-looking guy sitting in a glass booth who just kept on saying the same thing.
I was just following orders.
And that broke something in how she understood evil, because she realized this wasn't the monster. This was just a guy who did his job, who processed paperwork, who never once stopped to think about what any of that actually meant. She called it the banality of evil, the idea that some of the worst things in human history weren't done by psychopaths. They were done by people who just never questioned what they were told to do. So a year later, a psychologist named Stanley Milgram reads what Arendt wrote and basically asks, okay, but how true is that really? How far would a regular person go if someone in authority told them to? So he runs an experiment. He puts an ad in the paper, gets regular people to come into Yale, tells them it's a memory study. They pair you with a stranger. You draw lots. You get teacher, he gets learner. They take the learner into the next room, strap him into a chair, hook electrodes up to his wrists, and your job is just read questions through the wall. Every wrong answer after that, you turn the voltage up. The board in front of you goes all the way up to 450 volts. At 75, he grunts. At 150, he's asking to get out. At 300, he's pounding on the wall. At 330, nothing. Silent. Now, before he ran this, Milgram went to a bunch of psychiatrists and asked them to predict what would happen. They said maybe 1% of people would go all the way to 450 volts, maybe 2. The ones with the real psychological issues, 65% went all the way. 65% of regular people, teachers, accountants, fathers, people who answered a newspaper ad on a Tuesday, administered what they thought were potentially lethal shocks to a complete stranger. Because a guy with a clipboard said, keep going. Just sit with that for a second. And here's the part that gets me. There's an idea, and it's one of the most uncomfortable ones I've ever come across, that there is no such thing as not having a choice. Like ever, even in the moments when you're telling yourself you had no option, you're still choosing. The person at that table pressing the button at 450 volts, that was their choice. The lab coat didn't make it. The experiment didn't make it. They made it. And there's this whole thing about herd mentality, this deeply wired instinct we have just to hand over our judgment to whomever seems most confident in the room, to let the institution decide so we don't have to follow the system and call it being responsible. And it's not that people are stupid when they do that. It's actually one of the most human things there is. It's just that it was built for a completely different world. Jung talked a lot about the parts of yourself you never look at, the stuff you keep in the dark because you've never been forced to deal with it. And I think that's what Milgram was really pulling out of people. Not that they were secretly evil, but that they had never actually found out who they were when something real was on the line. Here's the thing I can't get out of my head, though. The learner wasn't real. He was an actor. The shocks weren't real. The whole thing was set up. But the sweat was real. The shaking hands were real. The people who wanted to stop, that was real. Milgram filmed the whole thing. You could see it on their faces. They were clearly struggling. They clearly knew something was wrong, and they pressed the button anyway. So go back to what I asked you in the beginning. Do you think you're a good person? Because what Milgram actually found wasn't really about good or evil. It was about whether people actually know themselves, whether the version of yourself you're so sure about actually exists anywhere outside of a situation where nobody's testing it. Arendt sat in that courtroom and watched Eichmann say, I was just following orders, and understood something most people still don't want to hear, that most of us will never actually find out who we are in that moment. We just find out when it happens. And by then, we've already pressed the button. That's what we do here. We take the ideas that have been sitting in philosophy books for decades and we make them real. Because philosophy isn't something you study, it's something you survive. This is the Philosophy Edge.
If you'd want more content like this, hit like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more.